Hey guys, compared with Key Concept 2.1, Key Concept 2.2 is relatively short. The expansion of European commerce accelerated the growth of a worldwide economic network. Keep in mind that this period begins in 1648, and so that expansion of commerce really began during Period 1, during that age of exploration and age of discovery, and will continue through even into Period 3 and Period 4 as Europe becomes a global leader. First point of Key Concept 2.2 is that early modern Europe developed a market economy that provided the foundation for its global role. And I'm going to go through just a few of the bullet points that are really relatively easy as well. And these come directly from the key concepts. But first of all, labor and trade in commodities, increasingly freed from traditional restrictions, ones that were imposed by governments and corporate entities. And so just really a good example of this, where they were freed from these traditional restrictions, is the fact that we're going to see the development of market-driven wages and prices. Although, we don't discuss the transfer to capitalism until Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in the late 1700s. Even during the mercantilistic period, we're going to see more market-driven trade, and as a result of supply and demand. Another important concept of this period is that the agricultural revolution increased the food supply. And so the agricultural revolution occurred during the late 17th and 18th centuries, and it was a major milestone in human development. There are several things that occurred during this time that are going to contribute to it, and part of it is the fact that the use of crop rotation increased cultivation. Fields no longer lay fallow, nitrogen storing crops restored the soil. The use of clover was important because clover produced better poop, which produced better fertilizer. And, we're going to see other crops, turnips as well. That's going to be good for the soil. And like I said, the fact that, more animals meant more meat. And like I said, more animals that ate meant more manure for fertilization, which in turn meant more grain for bread and porridge as well. Another part of the agricultural revolution was also something known as the enclosure movement in Britain. And essentially, increasingly, the enclosure movement, large landowners became prosperous and invested in technology. And as a result, they displaced many small, poor farmers who were forced to move to cities. And while this movement, these common lands being closed, no longer have the peasants no longer have access to open lands for crops, nor do they have access to hunting grounds. But even with this, we're going to see the development of commercial agriculture for the wealthy classes. On one hand, this was pretty hard for the generation that had to endure it, as many of the people had to leave to the cities. But this was occurring simultaneously to the Industrial Revolution, when more workers were needed in the cities. And so we will see the fact that the Agricultural Revolution led to, more food, and more food led to the fact that more industry and going on like that. The two countries that probably were the leaders with the agriculture movement were England and the Dutch. Another example of this period, this market economy, prior to the age of industry, was the development of cottage industry, also known as the putting out system, also known as the domestic system. And essentially, with this whole idea was that it's almost like a mini factory system in rural areas. And so, essentially, as population grew in rural areas, city capitalists eager to employ rural workers began becoming entrepreneurs. And essentially, these city capitalists would provide raw materials to the rural poor and to different households, who in turn would produce cloth in their homes. The merchants would pay them for their work by the piece, then sell the finished product for profit. And there were several results. Number one, farming families could have extra income. And extra income meant an increase in the ability to buy more luxury goods. Also, we'll see unregulated production, which is going to lead to really kind of experimentation, not only textiles, but housewares, musical instruments, and so forth. The city guilds had held very strict standards to maintain quality, and therefore discouraged development of new methods. But this rural experimentation actually helped to discover these new methods. And probably the best example was with the textile industry. Spinning and weaving of woolen cloth was most important. And, even by 1700, English industry was more rural than urban and heavily reliant upon cottage industry. And this English system will eventually spread into continental Europe as we see cottage industry expand. Later on, combined with enclosure and the agricultural revolution and less need for people in the rural areas, we'll see cottage industry uh, begin to decline as the factory system begins to increase. And finally, there were also new financial practices and institutions. We actually talked about this when we talked about period one. And this basically, we're going to see some other banking institutions that are working. The Bank of England is created during this time period. New definitions of property rights and so forth that will help contribute to the market economy. The continuation of the joint stock companies as well. Our next point is that the European-dominated worldwide economic network contributed to the agricultural, industrial, and consumer revolutions in Europe. And so before we start talking about and getting into a little more detail, let's just make sure that we understand what those are. So we've talked already about the agricultural revolution, which began around late 1600s into the early 1700s. The Industrial Revolution is really going to kick into gear in the late 1700s in England and into the 1800s in the continent. And the consumer revolutions will occur simultaneously to these two. Even cottage industry gave people extra money to buy more products. Combine this with the mercantilistic economies that existed, and overall, we're going to see, the growth during this time period of consumerism, which will continue into even the 18th and 19th centuries as well. Mercantilist policies towards colonies are going to continue, and I think we talked about mercantilism in our last period. And so just a quick review of mercantilistic policies. Number one, colonies were supposed to produce goods for the mother countries, provided with raw materials, which is going to also contribute to the triangular trade that will exist. Additionally, keep in mind, it was better to keep a balance of trade that was in the favor of the mother country. And so many of these countries will enact protective tariffs to keep their balance of trade positive. And finally, more gold and silver in the treasury meant more power as well. And so we'll see these policies continue into the late 1600s and into the 1700s. By the end of the 18th century, mercantilist policies will slowly begin to be replaced by capitalistic policies. The transatlantic slave labor system expanded due to increasing demand for products. And we had talked both about the triangular trade and the Middle Passage in the last unit, so I'm not going to revisit that, but do know that both of these continue during period two, through the 1700s as well. Actually, even into the 1800s. And finally, as I talked about earlier, the development of a consumer culture. More money meant more goods. And of course, keep in mind, most of these developments, this expanded economy occurred in the Western European nations. The Eastern European nations still remained relatively backwards as far as the agricultural revolution and industry was concerned. Lastly, due to the interaction with the New World and the Columbian Exchange, we're going to see an increased food supply due to the corn, but most notably to the potato. Several rulers in Central Europe made it a point to grow potatoes. Potatoes were easier to grow than grain, and we'll see, especially in Prussia and Ireland, potatoes will help to alleviate famine until the Irish potato famine in the mid-19th century. And lastly, I just want to emphasize the continued importance of the colonies for the countries. Once again, Spain is going to be focused in modern-day Latin America, the American Southwest, Mexico, Central America, and much of South America, Portugal and Brazil. The French, their most important colonies were in the Caribbean, but they also occupied vast areas of Canada and the present-day United States. And the English, who occupied the 13 colonies, the Atlantic seaboard, as well as several very lucrative Caribbean islands as well. And Commercial rivalries influenced diplomacy and warfare amongst European states in the early modern era. Um, there were the Atlantic naval rivalries, namely between Britain and France. Think Pirates of the Caribbean. And these rivalries extended into Asia, with the Dutch also involved as well, and ultimately resulting in, you know, the British settling in India, the Dutch in Malaysia, Indonesia, the French in Indochina by the late 1800s. One last thing about the warfare, we talked about that in Key Concept 2.1, but the big colonial wars were really the two most important would be the War of the Austrian Succession, known as King George's War in the New World, and the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War. I knew this key concept would be short. Our next review will be Key Concept 2.3. Enjoy.